Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome again to the Barry Lawrence Ruderman Conference on Cartography, Indigenous Mapping, sponsored by the David Ramsey Map Center. I hope you had a very nice lunch break. We are now about to begin panel 2, Historical Approaches, 19th and 20th Centuries. My name is Ana Pulido Rull. I am an associate professor of colonial art at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. I study indigenous maps from 16th century New Spain, and I just wrote a book about a corpus of native maps made in the 16th century known as land grant maps or mapas de Mercedes de Tierra. I would like to take a moment to thank the organizers and the sponsors of this conference, Salim Mohamed and Katie Parker, for putting together such a wonderful group of speakers and papers. The conference so far has been fascinating, so thanks to all the panelists and the keynote speaker. As in the previous panel, I will now introduce the 3 speakers in the beginning instead of doing so one by one to make the transition between the panelists easier and faster. We will have the Q&A at the end of the 3 papers. So if you have any questions for our speakers, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will read them at the end of the panel and we can all have a discussion. Keep in mind that the questions will be answered in the order in which they are received, and I will do my best to read them all. Okay, so it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Thomas Bassett. He is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Geography and GIS and former Director of the LAS Global Studies Program at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His writings on the history of cartography focus on indigenous mapping, administrative mapping, road mapping, and land privatization in Africa. He has contributed to 3 volumes of the history of cartography and is currently working on a book on the role of mapping in France's colonial conquest in 19th century West Africa. He writes on the political ecology of agrarian change in West Africa and the history of cartography in Africa. Today, he will present a paper entitled Drawing the Line, the Interplay of African and European Mapping Practices in Binger's Carte du Haut-Niger or Golfe de Guinée, par les pays du Congo et les Mossi. And our second speaker of this panel is Julie Macarthur. Dr. Julie Macarthur is an associate professor of African history at the University of Toronto. Her research interests include cartography and geographic imaginations, borders, mobility, and local practices of space, decolonization and sovereignty, memory and visual representation in modern Africa. She is the author of Cartography and the Political Imagination, Mapping Community in Colonial Kenya, and the lead editor of the Dan Kimathi on Trial, Colonial Justice and Popular Memory in Kenya's Mau Mau Rebellion, as well as several articles published in leading journals. She also works extensively in African cinema, both as a scholar and curator. Today, she will present a paper entitled Mobile Spaces, Indigenous Mapping and the Conquest of Eastern Africa. And our third speaker of this panel is André Reyes. He is an associate professor in the Department of Human Geography at the Universidade do Estado do Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. He is currently an honorary research associate at the Royal Holloway University of London and a member of the Commission on the History of Geography of the International Geographical Union. He will present a paper entitled Indigenous Maps in the Historiography of Brazilian Explorations. So we have an amazing panel ahead. Let's begin now. And we can begin with our first speaker, Dr. Thomas Bassett. Thank you very much. Dr. Bassett, go ahead.
Excellent, thank you. A pleasure to be here. Many thanks to the organizers, Salim, Katie, Laura, Guadalupe, Bren, Laura, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be participating in this event, and I'm learning so much about indigenous mapping practices in other parts of the world, so it's a lot of fun. I'd like to add that I live and work on lands that were the traditional home of the Peoria, the Kaskaskia, the Piankashaw, Way, Miami, Mascoutin, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations before they were forcibly removed. The stories of their struggles for survival and identity remain embedded in the land today. I'd like to begin by saying that the history of cartography of Africa is conventionally written from a Eurocentric perspective. It privileges the roles of European surveyors and map makers. This is true both in general histories like Geoffrey Stone's A Short History of Cartography of Africa, and in regional histories like Gerald McGrath's work, The Surveying and Mapping of British East Africa. In contrast, very little attention is given to indigenous mapping and its relationship to European mapmaking. My goal is to correct this omission in two ways. First, by showing the heavy reliance of European mapmakers on Africans who shared their geographical knowledge with them in the form of oral maps, ground maps, and written itineraries. And secondly, by demonstrating the significant influence of African political authorities who granted or denied permission to Europeans to pass through their territories. In this presentation, I will use the example of Benji's, Louis-Gustave Benji's 1890 map of the Upper Niger to the Gulf of Guinea to make my case. This is the map before you is the first edition of Benji's map. It's a 4-sheet map, which I've stitched together here for the purpose of this presentation at the scale of 1 to 1 million. So I want to focus on this map by Benji to make my arguments. And I should just go back to the previous screen to show you this map of the Niger Bend, the second edition in 1898, that lists the authorities that it draws upon. And I want to show you there's an image of a Tuareg woman drawing a map in the sand in the Sahara. And I want to make my arguments here using Benji's map. This is one of 3 editions. The second edition was published in Benji's book, published in 1892. And a third edition, similar to this first edition, was published in 1893. However, without the pink colors, which here show France's so-called possessions and spheres of influence. I want to argue in this paper that the vast majority of the routes shown in Benji's map derive from African sources. And secondly, because of the significant contributions of Africans to Benji's and other 19th century maps of West Africa, that these maps should be viewed as co-productions of European and African mapping. I draw upon 2 literatures to build my argument. The first focuses on maps as social spatial practices. That is, these maps, or mappings, as Kitchen and Darge call it, are designed and used in various contexts to solve socio-spatial problems, such as getting from point A to point B. Maps are viewed here as processes that emerge from map makers and readers' deployment of mapping practices, which are both technical and social. The second body of literature is more limited, but it does emphasize the interactions between European and African mapping. This literature shows that Europeans are dependent on African guides, interpreters, informants, and political authorities for geographical information that's important to their map making. And I want to argue that African mapping practices play a central role in these encounters. Now, Benji's also wrote a 2-volume work describing his 2-year travels through West Africa. And his narrative, as well as his map, provide many examples of this view of maps as processes in which Africans made important contributions. So there are research questions that guide this research. The first is what were the socio-spatial problems that Benji sought to solve in his map making? Secondly, what were his principal mapping practices? And third, to what extent did Africans contribute to the construction of his map? I used a mixed methods approach combining qualitative and quantitative methods. Qualitatively, I basically, I'm reading the published and non-published reports of explorers and topographers who are involved in making maps of this region. The text of these map makers they've left in the historical record contain vivid accounts of their reliance on Africans for basic route information. My principal quantitative method involves the digital analysis of maps. I rely on geographical information system software to calculate the length of the routes surveyed by Europeans in comparison to those provided by African informants. So I plan to spend the rest of my time providing answers to these three research questions. So let's go with the first one. What were the socio-spatial problems that Benji's mission sought to solve? So in Benji's grant proposal to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Undersecretary of the Ministry of Colonies, he emphasized three issues that he argued needed immediate attention. First, he noted that France had recently signed treaties with two African empire builders, Amadou Tall and Séméry Touré, which had given France access to a large area on the right bank of the Niger River in West Africa, which was believed at the time to be densely populated in a prosperous area, but about which little was known. So Benji was basically proposing a voyage of exploration. The second point he argued was that France needed to explore the fabled Kong Mountains that stretched across most maps of West Africa and Africa at the time. The mountains first appeared in James Rennell's map illustrating Mungo's Park's book on his journeys into the interior of Africa. And they appeared in subsequent maps in the 19th century, often attaining very kind of lofty proportions. These mountains were believed to be rich in gold and to be agriculturally productive. Benji proposed to explore trade routes through the Kong Mountains and to identify the kind of products that were being cultivated. Now, one of Benji's significant findings was that the Kong Mountains did not exist, that they were a figment of the imagination of European mapmakers. And I've written about this very topic with my colleague Phil Porter that we published an article in the Journal of African History in 1991. The third argument made by Benji was that although France had recently signed these treaties, the British were poised to move into this area, that the resident of the Nigeria was currently in Timbuktu and trying to advance into this area. So he said it was urgent for France to explore this area, to pass treaties with African states to beat the British. So it was a sort of inter-imperial rivalry going on that was motivating his exploration. So to answer the second question, what were Benji's principal mapping practices? I want to highlight 6 of them, and these are the ones that were principally used in Africa. The first was to construct a base map, which he did using European and Arabic sources of the area that he had planned to visit. And some of these sources had coordinates, lines of latitude and longitude, rivers, mountains, and some routes. And so Benji's goal was basically to use this map, his base map, to fill in the blank spaces. A second practice of Benji was to obtain the cooperation of local political authorities. Contrary to the view that this area was filled with blank spaces, in fact, this was not an unpopulated area. There were many African polities that France was competing with, in fact, as it was moving into this area. So we can see here, Sudan Français, or French Sudan, was an area that France had carved out in the 1880s based on treaties and military conquest, essentially a corridor stretching from Kai and Medine on the Senegal River as far as Bamako on the Niger River. Now, sandwiched between, France was sandwiched between 2 major African empires. To the south was the states of Séméry Touré, and to the north were the states of Amadou Tall. As I mentioned earlier, France had successfully conducted treaties with both Saint-Marie and Amadou in 1887, which encouraged Benji to explore the area. He decided it was safer to travel through Saint-Marie state, given Amadou's past practice of holding French explorers captive for long periods of time before allowing them to move forward. Now, Benji's travels were complicated by the fact that Saint-Marie was currently engaged in a war with Cheba to the east. Saint-Marie was trying to expand his empire to the east, in part because of the pressure from the north by France that was also pushing south. So Benji was traveling through a highly unstable area in 1887, 1889, when he, during the time of his expedition. So to travel through these areas, Benji needed the permission of these local authorities. And here's just one permit that he obtained in Kong that basically allowed him, it was written by the Imam of Kong, and it basically allowed Benji to travel unimpeded in Kong territory. A third mapping practice was Benji's strong reliance upon guides, interpreters, merchants, and other informants for geographical information. These individuals whose names Benji often cites in his book convey geographical information to him, such as routes of travel, the names of villages, their direction, and the distances between them. They also indicated the presence of rivers, mountains, and other physical and human geographical features. This oral mapping occasionally took a material form when informants drew lines in the sand and used bits of straw of different lengths to indicate distances between communities. In his book, Benji discusses collecting and using African itineraries for his own travels more than 50 times. In an appendix to his work, Benji discusses his mapping practices and notes that the total length of the routes he personally surveyed amounted to 4,000 kilometers. His African informants, he stated, provided him with more than 50,000 kilometers of itineraries. Fourthly, Benji used scientific instruments to make his observations. He used a compass, a chronometer, and other instruments to measure direction, elevation, latitude, and longitude. He determined the latitude and longitude of 14 points over this 2-year period. He recorded his observations in a notebook. This is the map. This is a map of the community of Uweso Bugu that Benji surveyed at the beginning of his travels. He arrived in Ulese Bugu about 3 days after leaving Bamako, but he was stopped by one of Saint-Marie's representatives and told he could not proceed until Saint-Marie authorized him to do so. So Benji decided to pass his time by mapping the surrounding area and collecting geographical information from local informants. 3 days after he toured the Ulese Bugu area, Saint-Marie's representative came to his camp and told him that his actions were causing great concern among the population. And his collecting this information was viewed as France preparing to invade the country. In fact, women had already fled the community in fear for their lives. Now, this caused Benji great concern because his basic mapping practices of using these instruments was now put in doubt. In fact, it caused him to adopt the fifth mapping practice, which is to conduct mapping covertly. That is, he was reluctant to take out his notebook and his compass and chronometer in the presence of other people in fear that they would not provide information or would stop them from entering their communities. So what he had to do was interview people and memorize the information they provided to him. That is, like his informants, whose oral mapping practices involved memorizing the names of communities, the direction of routes of travel, the physical human geographical features on route, Benji had to do the same thing. And then when he got back to his lodgings, he wrote down in his notebook what he had learned. He also relied upon his his guides, his informants. He traveled with about 13 people who led the donkeys with the gifts that he had brought with him to give to these various African rulers that would allow him passage through the territories. But also these guides were chosen carefully because they spoke local languages and knew the land through which they were traveling. So on one occasion, Benji was traveling to the community of Niele currently in current day northern Cote d'Ivoire. But the ruler there, Pege, refused to let him enter. Pege was allied with Cheba and knew that Benji was French and France had allied with Samari, and was concerned that by allowing Benji into Niele, that there could be adverse consequences. So what Benji did was send one of his guides named Jawe to present presents to Pege and to allow him to enter. Jawe returned and was unsuccessful in his negotiations, but he did write in the sand a plan of Niele. And it's this plan that Benji reproduces in his book and attributes to Jawe. So in summary, because of the apprehension of African rulers and Benji's informants, he had to modify his surveying methods to the point of incorporating African mapping practices, such as oral mapping and ground maps, into his own methods. The sixth practice that I want to highlight here is that he also collected written itineraries. These are mainly from travelers, mainly pilgrims, Muslim pilgrims who had traveled to Mecca and carried with them lists of place names between their home and Mecca. And here I'm going to read from Benji's account regarding these written itineraries. Quote, Benji wrote, every good Muslim possesses in a leather pouch the itinerary from his region to Mecca. It is concisely worded and includes directions like the following that I saw in the hands of Mamadou Lamine of Tenitu. So now this is what the list that Mamadou Lamine had. Leaving Sakala, which you can see in the lower left of Benji's map, in the Orodugu region, one walks for 11 days before reaching Kayeni in the Kurudugu region. After one passes through Banu, one enters the Diama region, or else one takes the route to Kong, where there are also many Muslims. So to what extent, my third question, did Africans contribute to the construction of Benji's map? I've already emphasized Benji's dependency on Africans for basic geographical information, such as how to get from A to B, and his collection of itineraries of travelers from areas he was not able to visit himself. A large portion of the information that was provided to Benji by African informants appears on his map as hachured lines. And this appears in the legend to his map. As you can see here, there are three types of routes that are depicted on Benji's map. The first is the solid red line that shows Benji's itinerary. The second type is the solid black line, which shows the itineraries followed by other European explorers. And the third itinerary shows the routes information provided by his African informants, called itinéraire par renseignement is what it shows here. I'm interpreting this as secondhand route information. So going back to Benji's map, we can see these routes clearly on the map. And I'm going to show them here as in digital format, just so you can see them. So here's Benji's itinerary, leaving Bamako in the upper left on the Niger River, going towards the center, towards Sikasso, where he stopped to visit Samari, and then going southeast towards Kong, where he was warmly welcomed. And then he went north up towards Ouagadougou, then came around through Salaga and came back to Kong, where he descended to Grand Bassam. The routes of other African explorers are also shown on Benji's map. In this case, I'm showing in black, solid black lines. And then, as I mentioned, the routes provided to Benji by African informants, I'm showing here depicted in this hachured purple line. You can see these same itineraries now superimposed in a contemporary map of Africa showing political boundaries to give you a sense of the vast area through which Benji traveled. Now, with the assistance of a graduate student at the University of Illinois, Sarah Riadi, who's also an expert in geographic information systems analysis, we determined the contribution of Africans to Benji's map in terms of the total distance of the routes they provided to Benji versus his own route and those recorded by other Europeans. The digital analysis involved 3 steps. First, we georeferenced Benji's map to a contemporary map, which is very accurate, and established 182 control points. Now, control points are basically locating, say, Bamako on the Niger River to the current map, and Olese-Bougou on Benji's map to the current map. So we know exactly the distance between locations. Once we georeferenced the map, we digitized the 3 route categories, as you can see here. And then the third step was to calculate the total distance of each route category. The results of that analysis are presented here in table 1. So Benji's 4-sheet map, we analyzed 1 sheet at a time, and we measured the distance of the itineraries of Benji's route in the second column, the routes of other Europeans, and then the African sourced routes. So I want to draw your attention to the bottom row, which shows the percentage of the total routes on the map is measured in kilometers. So Benji's route accounts for 11% of the routes on the map. Other European routes account for 14%, and the routes provided by African sources amount to 74% of the total maps, of the total routes shown on the map. So this quantitative finding supports the qualitative evidence showing Benji's heavy reliance on African informants in constructing his map. There's a second dimension here that I want to emphasize, that in addition to determining what Benji showed on his map, Africans also greatly influenced what he didn't show. By prohibiting his entry into important centers like Tengrela, Niele, and other areas, Benji was unable to collect first and secondhand information. This forced him to leave these areas as blank spaces on his map. This image shows Benji's hostile reception at Bobo Dioulasso, located in contemporary southern Burkina Faso. He was denied entry into this important training center and thus deprived of the opportunity to collect geographical information. On at least 8 occasions, Benji was unable to enter communities in areas under the influence of Cheba because of France's alliance with Samari Touré, and thus the perceived harm that might follow from Benji's travels in their area. These political tensions greatly frustrated Benji because he was unable to add new routes and localities to his map. And so when we look at Benji's map, we can see these vast areas that are left blank. So you can see in the sort of the western southern part of the map, there's these blank spaces in the Ouagadougou region, which is south of Tengrela, or in the center of the map, south of Niele in the Folona region, or north of Ouagadougou in the Atenga area, where Benji was greeted relatively warmly by the Naba, but was told he couldn't proceed any further. And that was, again, to Benji's disappointment because he had hoped to travel in that area. So to conclude, Benji's exploration and mapping, on one hand, was very successful. He revealed much about the political, social, and economic geography of the Niger Bend. He demonstrated that the most direct route from the Niger River to the Gulf of Guinea passed through Côte d'Ivoire. He revealed the region's major trade products and routes, and much about its population and political geography. He negotiated 4 protectorate treaties, which secured a large area for French colonial expansion between the Niger River and the Gulf of Guinea. And not least, he eliminated the Kong Mountains from the map of Africa. For his efforts, the Paris Geographical Society and the Paris Commercial Geographical Society both awarded Benji their prestigious gold medals for his accomplishments. The contributions of Africans were not mentioned in the awards ceremonies and accolades. As I've tried to show here, there were multiple hands in the drawing of Benji's map. African informants provided 3/4 of the routes shown on it, and African rulers also drew the line by barring Benji from entering their territories to collect geographical information. These areas are depicted as blank spaces on his map. Benji's dependency on African informants for basic geographical information and on political authorities to travel through their territories demonstrates that his landmark map is a co-production to which Africans made major contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. This was a fantastic presentation and took a lot of notes, and I really learned a lot. I would love to hear more at the end, at the Q&A, so thank you. I want to remind the audience to use the Q&A box to ask your questions, and we will read all of your questions at the end of the panel. And so now we're moving on to the next speaker, and our next speaker is Dr. Julie Macarthur. And yeah, she's already sharing her screen. Okay, so please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Anna, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this fantastic conference. And I'm quite humbled to follow Professor Bassett, a little intimidated, and to be in the company of such great, diverse, exciting scholars. I would like to start by acknowledging the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous and Métis people from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'm going to start with a quote. In this unending sea of the densest thorn bush, the view is restricted to a few yards, and the only way to plot a sketch map of the route is to take frequent prismatic compass bearings by sound. That is to say, on the lead camel to the neck of which was attached a tinkling bell. This type of country extends the whole way to Lug, the first point on the Juba reached, just miles and miles of bloody Africa, as one subaltern truly remarked. This comes from Sir Geoffrey Archer, who was a young colonial official, an avid hunter, and an amateur surveyor and photographer when he was sent to the vast and resistant region of the northern frontier of what would become colonial Kenya in 1912. Archer complained often of the difficulties of survey work in this, quote, as he said, blank space on the map, and remarked on the ability of his Somali guides, porters, and translators to, quote, strike across utterly featureless country by intuition as though marching on a prismatic compass bearing. This kind of landscape photography, as you see on the slide, revealed the imperial vision of the, quote, natural oneness of Somalis consumed in the horizontal plane of the landscape. Their instinctual sense of direction and place emphasized, and this photo comes from Geoffrey Archer's personal collection. Yet it also reveals the dependency of colonial surveyors like Archer on Indigenous mapping practices and knowledge for the cartographic surveys and construction of colonial boundaries in Eastern Africa, as much as Professor Bassett has shown in West Africa. In this quote that I began with from his memoir, Archer describes being compelled to plot his sketch map by sound, demonstrating an exchange and transfer of knowledge, Archer using the distinctive sound of the core, the wooden camel bells used by Somali pastoralists in their practices of spatial orientations, social organization, kinship, and navigation techniques, in combination with prismatic compass bearings to create his two-dimensional sketch map. Today, I want to talk about the mappings of Eastern Africa and encounters between mobile mapping practices among communities like the Somalis and the arrival of colonial cartography. Cartography has long been defined through the opposition of fixity and mobility, as others have mentioned, And colonial cartography worked to affix populations to particular territories, and in the process vilified practices of mobility as aterritorial and uncivilized. Mobility, however, often constituted relationships between space, time, and bodies in indigenous mappings. Somalis in Eastern Africa not only provided crucial knowledge and labor to colonial mapping projects, but also unsettled colonial geographies through counter-mapping strategies and decolonial alternative geographies that continue to unsettle borders and state-making into the present. To start, I'd like to acknowledge the complexity of the term Indigenous in Africa and African discourses. The term has been subject to a lot of debate over its applicability to African histories and communities, and it's not an easy term to define in the African context. Indeed, African contributions to Indigenous discourses have often challenged and shifted global definitions of indigeneity. When used, it is most often designated for pastoralists and hunter-gatherer communities, but many states in Africa do not recognize these communities as quote unquote indigenous or as more indigenous than other African communities, instead framing them as minorities and marginalized peoples. And for Somalis in Kenya, the main focus for this paper, though I draw on some other examples as well, this concept is even more complicated. Somalis dating back for centuries had made claims to ancestry in the Arab Peninsula. Somali political thinkers found useful currency in claiming foreignness in colonial hierarchies of race in Eastern Africa that left them quote unquote native aliens in colonial lexicons. This racial otherness, however, in the post-independence context has given way to indigenized claims and solidarities with other pastoralist groups seeking to redress through indigenous discourses and framings. The groups in Africa that have succeeded in gaining status or recognition as indigenous have not done so primarily on first comer or first people discourses, though those certainly exist and are often complicated by patterns of land use and mobility. Rather, those claiming indigenous status have done so on the basis, as Dorothy Hodgson has written, quote, of their cultural distinctiveness, long history of political subjugation, economic marginalization, territorial dispossession, and cultural and linguistic discrimination. And these groups have, as I said, largely been communities whose livelihood revolved around mobility, a mobility deemed irreconcilable with colonial governance and vilified or derided by post-colonial states. While indigenous mapping often raises debates around textual, pictorial versus oral or embodied forms of mapping, I would also like to explore the fixity, mobility, tension in practices. Mobility for people in East Africa mapped and made visible cognitive landscapes and territorial practices that I'll explore in a moment. I also want to talk a little bit about my recent work on photography as cartography. And this method provides a unique lens through which to study mapping encounters, providing insights not only into the imperial imaginations, visual practices, and cartographic work these photographs produced, but also the dependence on local labor and indigenous knowledge in the mapping of imperial territories in what Jamie McGowan has termed cartographic governmentality, as well as the practices of subversion and countermapping within the mappings of Eastern Africa. The event of photography interrupted the sovereign gaze and revealed spatial ruptures and fugitive meanings. These photographs captured the alternative temporality and mobility of social life of indigenous peoples, particularly in the borderlands that I work in. And importantly, they offer a way to see the, quote, unacknowledged indigenous contributions, as Professor Bassett has written, to colonial map making. And I'm happy to take further questions on this methodology, as it's still a newer approach to photography as cartographic work, and as a way to examine mapping encounters, the state fixations, and the fugitive landscapes and presences that reveal other layers of mapping and indigenous knowledge and spatial practices. So I'll start by talking a little bit about Somali practices of mobility and territoriality to situate the broader discussion, looking at what we learned from linguistics, archaeology, migration narratives, and oral traditions about indigenous mapping practices in Eastern Africa. First, Somali mappings were necessarily itinerant and relational. And we can see this in many different practices. For one example, and it's used often when we look at indigenous practices, place names reflected a pastoral ordering of space. Sites were named things like the place of moist udders, or the hill of milk, or the field of cattle. And they revealed social and material geographies that, while specific, could also shift in the landscape. And I'm increasingly interested in the agency of the environment and its own resistance and subversions to colonial mapping practices. These names revealed alternative histories of place and pastoral orderings of space through resources, wells, towns, grazing pastures, rivers, grave sites that all reveal nodes of pastoral activity. And I'll just briefly mention one other example. In the mobile practices of Somali pastoralists, as my colleague Safia Aidid has written, women were often responsible for dismantling the akal, which was the collapsible nomadic home, to move it seasonally to new sites. And this required specialized knowledge and skill for complex movements of entire villages to new pastures. As in many other indigenous languages, the terms for direction were often relational, not absolute or cardinal. In Western Kenya, British officials invented the terms Notsi and Sautsi, which have no relation to the local languages, to account for the fact that the same word, Masaba, which referred to Mount Elgon astride the Kenya-Uganda border, could mean west or north depending on one's location or dialect group. And these sectors of orientation were not solely applicable to nomadic cultures like the Somali or the Tuareg in West Africa, but also common in more sedentary traditions as in Western Kenya. Similarly, in the Somali language, no terms existed for longitude or latitude. So when creating a written Somali language in 1972, the terms for longitude and latitude were actually taken from the intersecting wooden poles that provided the frame for the akal collapsible home. And so the space of the mobile home literally translated into mapping lexicons. Political organization among diverse Somali populations, and it is important to stress that there are diverse forms of political organization among Somali populations, reflected hierarchical organizations of space and power and multiple overlapping sites of political authority and obligation, whether through clan confederations, religious mappings, economic trading routes, affective relations, and geographic relations. Lee Casanelli has prompted us to think about Somali spatial organization in terms of regional systems that can account for territorial belonging while not losing sight of the fluidity which characterized nomadic spatial and social relationships in the past, particularly as into the 19th century, Somali communities, in particular in the southern regions, made greater use of sedentary and urban practices, tying their communities more to specific territories than before in response to conflict, population growth, environmental shifts, and resource management. And just very briefly, this diverse history accounts for the diverse range of forms of belonging among the Somalis. Far from the static, homogeneous, clan-based kinship as argued in the past, there's a much more heterogeneous history of expansion, settlement, and territorial obligation. And it should, processes of identification are better understood, as Abdallah Omar Mansour has said, through processes of fission and fusion. And this is captured in the multiple terms of belonging. And also, as Jepsy Herbst has argued, such layered and hierarchical social relations were by no means unique to Somalis in pre-colonial Africa and reflected deeper histories of movement and settlement, space, and power. In the late 19th century, the strategic coastline of the Horn of Africa, well mapped while the interior remained little known to those outside the region, experienced multiple competing colonialisms that divided Somalis between multiple imperial formations, French, Italian, British, Ethiopian, and those in the British, what would become the British colony of Kenya, an area known as the Northern Frontier, the conquest of which was the bloodiest of all of Eastern Africa, but also produced a borderland that shifted multiple times and remained highly unsettled, at times purposefully unmapped throughout the colonial period. After his successful mapping of the western border of Kenya with Uganda in what was considered very difficult conditions, Jeffrey Archer was rewarded with being sent to the Northern Frontier, considered the most difficult border to map at the time, to try to bring cartographic order and imperial discipline to this remote and resistant region. Archer was by this time obsessed with cartographic work and increasingly used photography in his cartographic expeditions. In these photos, we can see how his vertical presence juts out of above the quote unquote haze that he lamented as one of the greatest obstacles to his cartographic work. And his gaze remains trained on the horizon, buttressed by the tools of the surveyor. And yet in both frames, his mastery of space is interrupted by the stowaway presence of Somali figures, inserting or withdrawing from the frame, and yet also visually insisting on their presence, which I'll explore a little bit more further on. In 1913, as officer in charge of the Northern Frontier, Archer was invited by the Royal Geographic Society to give a lecture on his cartographic surveys. For Archer, a young, very young colonial official and still an amateur cartographer, this invitation was quite a coup. While he could not attend, his findings were published along with a map in the Geographic Journal. In this article, Archer detailed the immense labor required to survey the waterless expanses, plentiful game, and host of inhospitable topographical and ecological impediments, despite the quote featureless nature of the landscape in this quote blank space of the map. The map Archer produced visualized a complex topography and quote unquote uncharted frontier, with the eastern edge of the map fading into blank space with little detail or marked borders. It also detailed the painstaking process and exactitude of his triangulation method that, as he wrote, created a rigorously structured space. The map, when read against Archer's writings and photography, provides a lens into Archer's self-conscious dependency on Indigenous geographic knowledge and mapping techniques, as well as the ability of local intermediaries to facilitate or subvert, through, for example, misinformation, misnaming, or outright resistance, the work of imperial cartography. This photograph was part of a series of photographs that documented the practical work of this survey team in the Northern Frontier, in which the local porters, guides, elders, and soldiers far outnumber colonial officials if they appear at all. It depicts mostly Somali laborers displaying the often cumbersome tools of cartographic surveys: concrete beacons, wooden measuring sticks, tripods, and alidades, and a variety of staffs, flags, and makeshift frontier posts that function both as tools for fixing survey points and manifestations of imperial power and claimed territory. As Matthew Edney noted in British India, quote, "The surveyor's jargon is heavily laden with imperialistic and appropriated connotations." As Catherine Morrissey has shown in the use of photography in the cartographic surveys of the US-Mexican border, Jeffrey Archer used photography much like he used cartography to bring the vast expanses of the Northern Frontier under his controlling gaze and to render abstract borderlines into visible and enforceable boundaries. And yet Archer's photographs belied this cartographic mastery. Instead, they revealed the imperial dependency on local and knowledge in map itself as process, the photographs capturing the temporality and process of becoming in the map encounter. In this photograph, the neatly organized line of Somali porters and aides displaying the tools of cartographic expeditions stand in stark contrast to the hazy, endless horizon Archer complained about and revealed hidden layers of Indigenous knowledge, agency, and labor. Archer often mentioned and named his intermediaries and his dependency on their knowledge, if still framed as quote unquote instinctual. In one case, Adin Warsama, a Somali of the Agdigala clan, impressed Archer with his fortitude, extensive knowledge of the terrain, and ability to track and collect birds at great distances, one of Archer's favorite pastimes. And Archer wrote, "Certainly I could never have begun collecting on the scale achieved without the daily cooperation of my collectors." Local practices and spatial knowledge came in multiple forms: the camel bell for prismatic locations, the Somali herd boys who would be sent as live wires to communicate points on the route between caravans, the ground maps that, as many others have remarked, had remarkable cross-cultural intelligibility, and more unrecorded or difficult to discern mobile practices that imperial cartographers relied on to navigate this mobile terrain. The mapping project itself was mobile. The permanence of these boundary markers was, however, illusory, undermined by the unruliness of the terrain, the subversion of local populations, and the need for constant maintenance and military reinforcement. The Northern Frontier was under military command for the first 24 years of its existence. Boundary markers required near constant adjustment due to ecological changes, but also the movement and use of borderland spaces by Somali pastoralists. One official noted the need for boundaries to account for distance in travel time rather than fixed geographic markers to better reflect Somali practices of mapping space, a practice that finds resonance with Inuit mapping practices studied by Renee Fawcett that Peter Martin also mentioned in his talk. Later, officials would suspect quote unquote misinformation by guides to the surveyors for the misnaming of key locations that left the official map series quote unquote utterly unreliable. Somali knowledge and labor was obviously critical to these mapping projects, but these archives also reveal calculated withholding, refusal, and outright subversion. I won't have time to go into each of the next images in detail, but I wanted to show a few more to give you a sense of the range of images and mapping practices they captured. Whether inserting or withdrawing from the edge of the frame, Somalis in the borderlands provided an elusive yet unavoidable presence, insisting on their occupation and knowledge of space beyond the sovereign claims of imperial conquest. Local leaders and elders played a variety of roles, including providing specialized knowledge, collaboration, boundary walking, ritual boundary markings, and the important role of witnessing. The unintentional capturing of borderland, of pastoral borderland social life, as in this photograph of a resting place, demonstrates the nuances and the depth to which these photographs can reveal alternative uses of space. Or in the case of the first image here on the top, the mobile houses of the background, or the manner in which Somalis pose and position themselves, sometimes ignoring the camera, at others engaging it directly rather than bothering with the focused gaze of the lone colonial surveyor trained on the horizon through the viewfinder of the Alidad. Through these presences, they refused their undifferentiated horizontal depiction subsumed in frontier landscapes and insisted on their autonomous agency and lived connections to the land beyond their use as tools in the work of imperial surveys. These interruptions, interventions, subversions, and dependencies were of course present in the maps themselves, from place names to withheld or misinformation, environmental shifts, and shifting spatial practices and claims to ownership and resources. And these images and narratives also speak to the decolonial alternative geographies that continue to unsettle borders and state making into the present. During decolonization, Somali partisans attempted to imagine a different kind of sovereignty, and that meant a different kind of mapping that I've written about elsewhere. They mobilized maps that erased and undermined colonial geographies, and also oral traditions and songs that claimed land not through a map, but through their mobile presence in space. But decolonization was also the first time that this northern frontier border would be policed and used to stop movement during the Shifta War over Kenya's northern frontier, which put the region into a state of emergency until 1991, and continued insecurity has led to new efforts to concretize the mapped border across a space imagined to be united by Somalis through movement. And just to end, I wanted to give a couple of ideas about these alternative geographic imaginations. Neruddin Farah's classic novel Maps illustrates the connections made between pictorial maps and the mobile spaces they capture. The young boy Asghar argues that his maps invent nothing, but they identify, quote unquote, a notional truth. Recently, in the past few years, the Kenyan plans to erect a border wall along the northern frontier has resurfaced many of these debates. Much of the controversy over the planned border wall has centered around practices of mobility, trans-border trade, as well as the physical houses of those living around and indeed across the border. In 2018, residents of Bulahawa pulled down sections of the wall, saying it interfered with their family connections and organizations and their ability to trade. But construction has resumed in the past year with a concrete wall, barbed wire, electric fence, and trenches along the border, along with electronic surveillance cameras to monitor movement on both sides of the border. The maps of colonial conquest and the indigenous knowledge that produced and that contested them still have this dominant rule. But I wanted to end with a quote from a Somali Canadian rapper, Kanon, who draws on a long history of poetic spatial knowledge and argues for decolonized spatialities for the songs to actually elicit the seeing of Indigenous geographies, as our keynote speaker for tomorrow has powerfully argued in relation to Native women's writings. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't speak too quickly. Peter Martin, thank you for giving me the permission to speak quickly with my Scottish heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. That was a wonderful presentation and incredible how you highlight these relationships and how you make us think about the importance of mobility for cartographic practices. So thank you very much. And we will continue with the Q&A after our third speaker. So if you have questions for Julie or for Tom, please leave them in the Q&A box at the bottom right of your Zoom screen. And now we are moving on to our third speaker of the panel. His name, he's André Reyes Novaes. So André, do you have your presentation? Are you going to share your screen?
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I want to say that it's a great pleasure to participate in this wonderful conference. I learned a lot with all the panelists today. And I also want to thank for Katie, Laura, Salim, and Tyler for the invitation and all the support. Finally, I wanted to say that it's a great pleasure to share this panel with Thomas and Julie as well. So today I will explore the indigenous maps as historiography and Brazilian exploration. The study of indigenous maps prompted fundamental question for map history. And I will just share here. Okay, perfect. So yeah, I will explore these indigenous maps and historiography in Brazilian exploration. So the study of indigenous maps prompted fundamental question for map history. The definitions and category used to approach these maps could express different frameworks to understand cartography and exploration. Rather than address the history of specific artifacts considered essentially as indigenous maps, my presentation will deal with different scholarship debates in the construction and understanding of this category. Although exploring examples of material and performative maps, my concern today is historiographical, not historical, bringing to the light debates on Brazilian exploration from the 40s and the 50s to contribute to understanding indigenous maps as hybrid artifacts and performative practices. So I will set the scene with the identification of different traditions in the study of indigenous maps. Then I will address how the historiography of Brazilian exploration, more specifically the writings of Jaime Cortesão and Sérgio Buarque de Holanda, approached indigenous maps as communication device in colonial encounters. Finally, I will suggest how debates on indigenous knowledge push us to the edge of map history, considering the agency of performative cartography in the Portuguese depictions of South America during the colonial period. Considering post-colonial and decolonial claims to challenge the geopolitics of knowledge, where the North is expected to provide theory and the South raw material for scientific inquiry, this paper highlights potential contributions of South traditions in the study of indigenous maps. So the historiography of indigenous maps was have many entries and involves different fields, approaches, and places. Any intention to produce an exhaustive survey will necessarily fall into incompleteness. Anyhow, Anglo-American historiographical accounts often identify some turns and traditions in the study of these maps. In his book on cartographic encounters, Malcolm Lewis addressed how, for various reasons, native maps began to attract the interests of scholars, and I quote, first as individual curiosity, then as a scientific category, and finally as evidence of native ways of world making. Following Liu's approach, the first generation of scholars and scientists to mention in their writings maps made by Indians were those participated in exploration, engaging in scientific fieldwork, or that had some of the frontier experience. Publishing their reports, mainly in journals from geographical and exploration societies during the 18th and 19th centuries, these authors often approached indigenous maps as devices for knowledge transfers in colonial encounters, describing their contents and rarely reflecting on the nature and their relationship with broader issues in map history. The second tradition identified by Lewis was predominantly German and became more remarkable after the establishment of German Empire in 1871. In this context, indigenous maps become recognized as a distinctive category of cartography. And their study was influenced by the academic institutionalization of fields such as geography and ethnology. Between 1870 and 1810, authors such as Richard André, George Frauenstein, Hogans, Drober, and Bruno Adler published books and monographies that promoted indigenous maps as a field of study, systematically comparing practice from native people on global scale. The title from André's pioneer monography, Ethnographic Parallels and Comparisons, and Adler's book from 1910, Maps and Primitive People, demonstrate how maps were approached as evidence of the degree of civilization in many of these investigations, framing cartographic history in evolutionist material culture studies. So the third and well-known tradition in the study of indigenous maps emerged in the late 20th century, considering the circulation of critical and interpretative approaches in the history of cartography. The landmark of this third occurred when the History of Cartography project created by Brian Harley and David Woodward published its volumes on cartography and traditional societies. As suggested by Zeman, Book 2.3 on cartography in the traditional African, American, Arctic, Australian, and Pacific societies, edited by Woodward and Lewis in 1998, would be considered the most culturally related of the series. The editors classified the volume, and I quote, as the first global attempt to describe and explain traditional cartography since Bruno Adler's path-breaking study in 1910. However, in contrast with the early 20th century geographer, the book explicitly avoided framing indigenous maps as primitive, simpler, preliterary, or savage, admitting the challenges to draw hard boundaries and fast boundaries between tradition and European cartographies. So this relativistic, contextualized, and interpretative approach opened two questions that we'll be exploring in my presentation today. The first one is about hybridity and cross-cultural exchange, and this question was so nicely explored by Thomas today. Despite dealing with traditional societies, many chapters from Book 2.3, such as those writing by Barbara Mundi, Thomas Bassett, and Michael Lewis, highlight co-production as a fundamental aspect of the mapping process during colonial encounters. According to the editors, far from being denied or just erased, indigenous maps can be regarded as a source of ideas that enrich mathematical cartography and geographical information systems. In a chapter published in 1994, Brian Harley suggests that the recognition of early maps as an epitome of encounter, a set of reciprocal relationships between Native Americans and European people, was relatively new, according to him, and stimulated scholars to address this topic as a critical inquiry in cartographic history. The second question is about performative cartography that was quite well explored by Julie in her presentation. Quoting Harley's definition of a map as a graphic representation in the book 1, Woodward and Lewis suggested that the very terms map and cartography need some elaboration for the book 2.3. The authors argue for three kinds of mapping practice related to material, cognitive, and performative cartographies. Seeking to frame map history in the general history of communication about space, the chapters were not limited to formal map-like representations and seriously investigated ideas, ceramics, textiles, gestures, rituals, chants, dance, poems, and other communicative practices used to share spatial knowledge. Recognizing a no-consensus approach on the use of terms such as oral maps or wayfinding practice, Woodward and Lewis identify a definitional controversy. To dodge the controversy, the editors clearly stated that their book was concerned less on constructing inclusive and exclusive criteria for what might be considered maps, and more with shedding light on how certain members of the society represent and codify spatial knowledge. Although represented as new and challenged, these questions also appeared as crucial aspects in other traditions in the study of indigenous maps. Looking to the 100-year distance between German and North American tradition, it seems reasonable to ask, which other periods and places of knowledge production could be studied to enlarge these historiographical accounts? This question would have many answers, and in the following session, I will explore how indigenous maps were explored in Brazilian exploration studies during the 40s and the 50s, considering the work of the Portuguese scholar Jaime Cortesão and the Brazilian historian Sérgio Buarque de Holanda. So the Portuguese scholar Jaime Cortesão arrived in Brazil in 1940, leaving the war in Europe and the dictatorship in his country. As a previous director of the National Library of Portugal, Cortesão was very well received among scholars in Brazil, who have been developed studies in territorial exploration and maps since the early 20th century. Cortesão's arrival was celebrated in newspapers, and the scholar was quickly invited to give lectures in different institutions and societies. In 1946, Cortesão was hired by the National Library of Rio de Janeiro, and his main task was to comment on the Angeles collection, a group of almost unexplored documents on Brazilian colonial encounters. Also in 1946, the Brazilian historian Sérgio Buarque de Holanda was named director of the São Paulo Museum, an institution that progressively became interested in collecting documents and artifacts about exploration and discovery. During the late 40s, Holanda became one of the main interlocutors of Cortesão, debating topics such as Portuguese agency in Brazilian exploration and the role of indigenous knowledge in colonial mobility. In my presentation, I will approach this debate using newspaper articles and monographies published by these authors. In a newspaper article published at the Diário de Notícias, Jaime Cortesão wrote for the first time about a group of exploration maps gathered by him at the National Library of Rio de Janeiro. These maps, dating from 1721 and 1724, portray a region between São Paulo and Minas Gerais that was explored and mapped for the first time during the 18th century. According to Cortesão, these maps were used as a source for the new Atlas of Brazil, produced in 1730 by the Jesuit priest Diogo Soares, and were marked by a native cartographic art, in his words. These maps were probably drawn by many hands, and Cortesão used this hybridism and co-produced feature to distinguish two kinds of maps in the collection. The Bandeirantes maps expressed an indigenous art, and I quote, simple, rude, and vigorous tradition to depict geographical facts. In contrast, the Sertanistas maps expressed another tradition of map making, demonstrating the introduction of new practice by the mathematician priests who arrived in significant number in Brazil in the late 18th century. One of the maps classified by Cortesão as a hybrid artifact produced by Indians and explorers was the map called Ideia da Topografia até as Novas Minas Gerais, which you can see in more details in the exhibition of this conference. The schematic and communicative role of the map is explicit in its title, which seems to provide an idea of the paths until the new mines at Cuiabá. On the right side of the map, it's possible to identify the village of São Paulo and the Tietê River, a fundamental starting point for exploring the Brazilian territory. The symbols and the text are pretty helpful for those who will make the journey. And it's not by chance that the unique indigenous tribe identifying the map, called Guayacus, were classified as infamous or disgraceful Indians. The Guayacus were famous for being reported as brave Indians who had learned to use horses to attack the invaders. The Guarani Indians named Guayacu to refer to their enemies who occupy the west margin of the middle course at the Paraguay River. Guayacu actually is a pejorative term. Gua means native or inhabitant. Ai means evil, traitor, and Kuru means dirty skin. Thus, the name would mean evil people with dirty skin. And this denomination suggests that the Guaranis were the sources of the information for the map. In his analysis of this map, Jaime Cortesão does not pay much attention to these nomenclatures, and he seeks to demonstrate the Guarani influence through visual information. The map symbols demonstrate rapids, rockets, and waterfalls, and Cortesão suggested the existence of specific graphic language among Guaranese Indians to portray these features. To support his argument, Cortesão suggests to place side by side these 18th century maps with maps published in travel accounts commented by Bruno Adler in his early 20th century book. To approach the cartographic knowledge of South American Indians, Adler mentioned books published by the explorer Carl von der Steening, who guided his second Xingu expedition using, and I quote, a map from a Suya Indian. Mentioning and reproducing the map published by the German explorer, Cortesão suggests a clear similarity in the ways waterfalls were portrayed by short lines crossing the rivers. The way to portray waterfalls as one essential piece of information for those who will navigate the river is presented by Cortesão as proof of a native cartographic art with great power of synthesis and communication. A significant piece of Cortesão's conclusion on these exploration maps was drawn from a monography published by Sérgio Buarque de Holanda in 1949, called Indians and Mamelukes in the Expansion of São Paulo. To approach indigenous maps and exploration techniques, Holanda also commented on exploration maps from the 18th century and travelers' accounts from the 19th and 20th century quoted by Adler, such as von der Steening. Considering Steening accounts, Holanda reports the explorer's surprise when he saw his informants draw a figure that looked like a corkscrew to represent the Batovi River. However, when exploring the river a few years later, the explorer realized that that the river was highly winding, understanding that the Indian object was not, and I quote, reproduce all the sinuosity of the course, but only to indicate the extremity irregularity to warn the inexperienced traveler. This communicative function of the map, which take the advantage of previous experience and apply a language where everything aims utility, according to Cortesão, is considered both by Holanda and Cortesão as a fundamental aspect of indigenous maps. Far from seeking a mimetic or Euclidean purpose, this map had a communicative function, as many contemporary maps produced to place touristic information or tube station, for instance. As pointed out by Matthew Edney, rather than a singular endeavor or a monolithic enterprise, cartography characterized by a restricted set of specific practices, map history should be understood through internal changes and external interactions of several cartographic modes. If we stop asking that what a map is, strictly associating it to Western cartography geometric proposals, we could consider non-geometrical tradition as relevant subjects of inquiry in map history. During the first encounters in Brazil, a significant part of European medieval cartography also had non-geometrical proposals and functions, and these practices were mixed in colonial and exploration maps to portray paths, rivers, and mountains. Using similar manuscript maps and exploration reports, Cortesão and Holanda approached crucial aspects in map history, considering indigenous maps as material artifacts of encounter produced by hybrid representation practice. So another very tricky aspect of map history is related to non-material cartographies and performative practices. Concluding his broad analysis of the emergence of the cartographic ideal, Edney suggested that the focus should be on mapping, not cartography. Drawing on Dennis Wood's discussions about map making as material culture and mapping as the process of perceiving and representing, Adney argues that scholars need to study the process of mapping, which is to say, the dynamic ways in which maps are produced, circulated, and consumed. According to the author, dynamic is a key word because mapping processes are fluid and the maps they generate are mutable and volatile. However, as Adney warned us, avoiding the word cartography and all that it stands for is easier to do than reforming the use of the word map. Brazilian exploration studies from the 40s and the 50s certainly have no answers or models to address these complex contemporary questions. However, discussions around another group of maps commented by Jaime Cortesão could provide insights into possible connections between cognitive, performative, and material maps. Contrasting with previous maps that portray a small portion of the territory, this map suggests that indigenous narratives influence broader representations of the continent. Maps from Bartolomeu Velho, Luiz Teixeira, Nicolas Sanson, among others, were presented in Cortesão lectures both as a graphic manifestation of the Portuguese geopolitical claims against the limits of the Tordesillas Treaty, as well as graphic expression of indigenous narratives and imaginative geographies about South America. By discussing the relationship between Indians' narratives about the continent and colonial maps made by Portuguese and Spanish cartographers, Cortesão offered an example that can feed contemporary debates on oral and material maps. In an article originally published in a newspaper Correio da Manhã in 1947, Cortesão analyzed this series of maps where Brazil was portrayed as an island, detached from the rest of the continent by the encounter between the Amazonas and Prata rivers. According to Cortesão's claim, Portuguese diplomacy consciously stimulated graphic and oral narratives in which Brazilian territory was depicted as an island. On the other hand, on one hand, the geographical imaginations of these massive units could help to challenge the limits of Tordesillas Treaty, showing natural borders between Brazil and Spanish Empire. On the other, the circulation of narratives about a mythical lake full of gold in the center of the continent stimulates many explorations to the countryside, having São Paulo as a starting point. As I explore elsewhere, by giving political agency and intentionality to the myth of island Brazil, Cortesão reconciles national and colonial identities, framing Brazilian exploration as a continuity of Portuguese colonial expansion. In addition to newspaper articles, Cortesão's thesis was presented in many lectures and seminars, often illustrated by schematic maps made by the artist Ari Duarte, to improve the audience visualization of his arguments. Despite being a central example to support the Portuguese agency in Brazilian expansion, the island Brazil was also described by the Portuguese scholar as a heritage of indigenous geographical imagination, and I quote, the most typical and fruitful example of fusion of cultures, in his words. In an article published a year after, in 1948, at the newspaper Amanhã, Cortesão was quite explicit in his aims to collect maps and travel accounts to reveal, and I quote, the indigenous origins of the island Brazil myth. The cartographic example classified by Cortesão as the most notable was the map from Bartolomeu Velho from 1561, where the rivers Prata and Paraná were connected by the Eupana Lagoon. According to Cortesão, a significant part of the map was produced collecting information from the recent Portuguese exploration in the territory, depicted in different schematic maps from Ari Duarte. However, as a hypothesis, Cortesão suggested that the other part of the map was composed by indigenous information, in his words. To support his hypothesis, Cortesão used a series of didactic maps from Vaz Dourado, André Homem, and Nicolas Sanson, and collected various travels accounts from the 16th and 17th century. He started his article with a narrative from Fernando Ribeira from 1543, who explored the Paraguay River and reported that Indians at the north of Charales Lagoon informed about the existence of a kingdom placed in a vast lake, the House of the Sun, according to the Indians, where inhabitants lived full of metals and precious stones. The cosmography, Lopes Velasco, from the Spanish side, reported in his Geografía y Descripción de las Indias from 1574 that it is related to the Indians the information about the connections between the Prata River and the north of the continent, and also quotes the huge lake full of gold, which they quote, Portuguese heard about and started drawing in their maps. In his accounts from 1584, called Tratado Descritivo da Terra e Gente do Brasil, Gabriel Soares de Souza also attributed to the Indians the information about a river connections with a big lake where lived other people. Later in the 17th century, the Jesuit priest Simão de Vasconcelos also reported that Indians from the interior describe a deep lake where two rivers can be seen holding their hands in the slopes of the great mountains range of Chile and Peru. To explain the rise of this myth among the Indians, Cortesão quoted different archaeological and linguistic studies about cross-cultural exchange and indigenous circulation before the first colonial encounters. Rather than a circulation limited by the surroundings, indigenous tribes travel and migrate throughout the continent. Using the investigations of the ethnologist Erland Nordenschuld, Cortesão and Ari Duarte produced schematic maps on Guarani migration during the 16th century, arguing for an intense circulation and changes among different indigenous cultures. These mobilities, according to Cortesão, could explain the circulation of information on the Inca Empire at the Andes among indigenous tribes in the Amazon and Central Plateau. Quoting the Argentine historian Henrique de Gandia, Cortesão argues that the island Brazil could be related with pieces of evidence from the Inca civilization, transmitted and deformed by Indians in Brazil. It is impossible, actually, to assess what kinds of performances and artifacts were used to transfer this knowledge among the Indians. And we often have to deal with fragments of these encounters in travel accounts for the newcomers. The Western gaze and colonial aims mainly direct these accounts to focus on the information per se, or the material map, and not in the performative knowledge transfer process. Anyhow, the oral spread of the Island Brazil myth is an exciting example of the connections between the narrative construction of South America geographies and the materialization of these histories in artifacts more readily accepted as maps. Cortesão's thesis, however, was not completely accepted among Brazilian scholars. Sérgio Buarque de Holanda, for instance, challenges Cortesão's claims about the island Brazil. In an article published in 1952 in the Diário de Notícias, Holanda stated that Cortesão's theories had powerful objections. Their controversies, however, were mainly focusing on the geopolitical agency of Portuguese diplomacy in Brazilian exploration and not in the indigenous origins of the myth. According to Holanda, plenty of documents from the early colonization demonstrates that Portuguese instructions recommended the inhabitants to stay in the coast and, I quote, avoiding entering the countryside with the Indians. Although many 16th century maps portray a central lagoon connecting the Amazon and the Prata, Holanda pointed out that this myth had no impact on Brazilian exploration. Nevertheless, the central role of indigenous knowledge in the early imaginative geographies of South America was not challenged. In fact, Holanda emphasizes the role of Mamelukes and Indians in Brazilian exploration studies in a very original way. In his monography, quoted by Cortesão, Holanda explores a series of indigenous practices and wayfinding and path reading in colonial Brazil. Considering human and animal tracks, Holanda highlights the practice of reading of steps, which pointed out directions and revealed travelers' identities. These maps of footsteps would be so widely read in Spanish America that, according to Holanda, they were even reproduced in cartographic scratches. Again, performative and cognitive maps helped us to understand the process of formulating maps themselves. Many other techniques, such as broken branches, stone places, and marks on leaves, are cited by Holanda as displacement and orientation techniques. These practices are certainly parts of the general history of spatial communication. So our broad question is, would we be prepared to understand them as mapping? In his influential book on econology, Thomas Mitchell alerted his readers that his book was not about images, but about the things people say about images. Considering how we talk about the idea of imagery and its relation notions of picturing, imagining, and perceiving, the author identified a family of images. In this genealogy of the term, images could be graphic, optical, perceptual, mental, or verbal, grouping very different things such as pictures, memories, and metaphors. However, as Mitchell pointed out, we often ask which family members should be called images in a proper sense, and which were called in some figurative sense of the term. Instead of becoming gatekeepers, it is perhaps more productive to study maps as a complex phenomenon, considering the exchanges and complementarities between different representational practices. By blurring the borders and the boundaries between different types of images, the study of indigenous maps can challenge several assumptions and hierarchies from cartographic ideal. Bringing light to accounts from Brazilian exploration studies, the central aim of my talk today was to argue on the importance to approach other places of knowledge production to deal with complex topics in map history. Far from being just a place to catch raw material for theoretical reflections made elsewhere, the Sound should be understood as a knowledge production center as well. This other center is definitely not isolated or authentic in an essentialist way, and the vast literature in German, English, and French supporting Cortesans and Hollander writings demonstrates the mobility of and reception of knowledge from different places. However, this knowledge was organized and combined originally in Brazilian exploration studies, attending local demands and debates embedded in local, national, and colonial identities. Approached from a contemporary gaze, these accounts could help us to enlarge our understanding of maps as communicative and performative practice, and reaffirms that place matters in the process of production and reception of knowledge. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, André, for this wonderful presentation. It really got us thinking about what is implied in making a map and, you know, the process of mapping as a dynamic practice. So thank you very much. Okay, so let's go now to the questions. Let me remind the audience that if you have questions for any of our speakers, please type them at the Q&A box. And I'm going to read the questions that we have now. So the first question is for Thomas Bassett, and it's a question by Vera Dorofeva-Lichtman. And she asks, were there really indigenous methods of mapping incorporated into Benji's maps, or rather data obtained from indigenous mapping?
Right, thank you for that question. Yes, I would say that indigenous mapping methods were incorporated into Benji's map. If we view maps as processes, right, that emerged in the course of their surveying and production, and view them as iterative and contingent, well, what strikes me about Benji's mapping was that he couldn't perform his normal practices of surveying and taking notes. He had to put those away. And in his interviews with these African informants, he had to use his what he called prodigious memory. And he uses that word a number of times in his book, how tiring it was for him to collect this information. And so what I see him doing is adopting this African method of memorizing, right? That's kind of like, as André pointed out, this performative oral mapping practice of memorizing these details. He had to do the same thing. Now, he had the advantage of going back to his compound and writing a notebook. And so I would view this as a hybrid method of practice. And so those itineraries that he obtained in that manner, to me, represent this adoption of African mapping methods or practices in a hybrid form. Yeah. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. The next question, it's a comment. It's by Ina Shkurti, sorry. And she says, amazing presentation, Professor Macarthur. And the next question is from Karen Pinto. I love the Somalian saying that wherever the camel goes is Somalia. Would love to hear more about this concept, given how far and wide the camel goes, including America, whence the camel came to Africa and Asia. Thanks for a terrific talk, Julie.
Thank you, Karen and Ina as well for your comment. The saying is quite common, and there are variations of it, particularly in a lot of oral Somali poetry, which dates back centuries. The centrality of the she-camel, Mandik, as a sort of symbol for nationalist or solidarities between different Somali groupings. The saying itself was highly politicized, particularly in the 1960s, because it threatened notions of territoriality, right? It threatened the sanctity of boundaries that were beginning to become the boundaries of independence. And so in the 1960s, when Somali activists were using this language and were mapping a space of Somali sovereignty that threatened, and this was sort of visualized in the five-pointed star of the Somali flag, and also written into the very constitution, the claiming back of lands where Somalis lived. This saying got used by Kenyan nationalists and sort of turned on its head. So Jomo Kenyatta, the first president of Kenya, within this conflict says, if you want, you can pack up your camels and go. The idea being wherever they actually were, that's where the border would end. And so if they did not want to be part of a Kenyan nation, they would have to actually leave that territorial space. If you're interested in those debates more thoroughly, I've written an article in the American Historical Review called Decolonizing Sovereignty that looks specifically at those mapping practices during the decolonization period. It's an insufficient answer, but I hope I addressed it a little bit. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for your answer. So we got another question by Katie Parker. She says, I have both Julie and Andrew discuss regional applications of the terms indigenous and gave examples of more localized names. To what extent is it helpful to have a global historiography of indigenous mapping? And to what extent must it remain local or regional?
Julie, if you want to start, I don't know. I can start, but
go ahead.
Okay. Oh, I think it's a very nice question, actually, if we need a global historiography or not. Actually, the historiography can be huge, isn't it, if we take into account many places of knowledge production. But I think we have something that it's important to compare different contexts of knowledge production. Because, for example, the idea of hybridism and hybridity was very, very discussed in Brazil during the 40s and the 20s. And it's interesting to see, of course, related with national identity and other discourses that were interlocked with this term. But I think it's very rich to compare different contexts in the use of this kind of term, for example, hybridity. And I think we have to learn comparing different experiences. But I understand the questions, because it's also important to go deep in very specific contexts as well, to understand like the toponyms from the maps and understand the context that the maps circulated. So I think probably we need a kind of balance to not to neglect a global vision, but at the same time to try to go deeper in specific local cases. I think it's my view on that.
Thank you, Karen, for the, was it Karen for the question? Katie for the question. I felt an obligation to make very specific that the term has produced a lot of controversy in the African context. If I were to give this same talk in Kenya, that would be the majority of the questions. It would center around even the positioning of Somalis in the northern frontier as an indigenous population. And indeed, as I mentioned, the Somalis themselves haven't always in their history positioned themselves as indigenous to that area. And it depends on our definition of indigeneity. And one of the things that I've been working on and trying to elaborate is how Somali conceptions of territoriality and indigeneity rely on a concept of mobility that is at odds with a lot of global discourses on indigeneity. However, I do think there's a really useful, and certainly I think this conference is showing it, useful cross-regional conversation that can happen by focusing on these mapping practices that perhaps indigenous isn't the right term, but at least marginalized or not non-cartographic, however we want to frame it, is really useful. I know that in my own work, as Thomas Bassett well knows, there's a limited scholarship on this kind of work in the African context. And so I've found a lot more use in, for example, Renee Fawcett's work that Peter Martin also mentioned on the Inuit, the idea of distance and time being more important than a kind of concrete measurement of distance. I've found great resonances with the work of Raymond Crabe and Alex Hidalgo. And so, and in the African context, there, even within the African context, as Thomas, I think his presentation and also my presentation show, there's a great variety of different practices, some textual, some oral, some using a variety of these different techniques. And so homogeneity isn't a great way to approach it, but that specificity is really useful, but it also is useful to have those cross-regional conversations because I think they open up possibilities of understanding those alternative geographic imaginations that have been subsumed under the kind of dominant cartographic ideal, as Edney would say.
Thank you very much, Julie and Andre, for your answers. I want to invite the audience, if you have any more questions, please type them in the chat. Otherwise, there seems to be no more questions in the Q&A box, so we have to stop now. So I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, Salim, Katie, and Laura. I would like to thank our panelists, Tom, Julie, and Andre, for an amazing afternoon. And of course, I would like to thank the audience for your questions, for being here, and for being part of this greater conversation. So I look forward to the following days to continue these conversations about mapping and what it entails and different practices and different ways of conceptualizing what a map may be. And I guess I spoke too soon because there is one last question in the Q&A. It just came in. Question to Andre. Did James Cortezao use the term hybrid maps? Andre, you're muted.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Actually, this investigation started by looking to this word. I was reading about the history of Brazilian colonization, the historiography of Brazilian borders, actually. And then it quite surprised me the way that he used the word hybrid, and also the way that he talked about maps as a co-production artifact. And for me, in the first moment, I was surprised, and I want to investigate it more about his narratives and his history of cartography courses. Of course, when I deeper my investigation, I saw how these have a lot of connections with power relations in Brazil, like the interests from the elites to not. That's the thing. It's a different issue in a southern country. In this idea, like the interest of the elites to include indigenous in the national identity. So it's a fundamental strategy since the 20s to include the indigenous people inside the whole national identity. And it's why Cortezão pushed these maps as hybrid forms and hybrid representation. But yeah, he used the word, and Yeah, I explored a little bit on that in a paper that will came out in the Journal of Historical Geography as well, and explored a little bit these ideas about hybridity in different contexts. But thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, André, very much. And thank you everyone for your questions. So if we don't have any more questions, then we can finish here. Thank you again very much to the organizers of the conference, and we will continue our talks and conversations tomorrow. Good afternoon, everyone.